This is a very brief talk about AMBIT. AMBIT is a mentalization-based approach to work with hard-to-reach and complex young people who are often not in an actively help-seeking frame of mind when approached by teams, often in outreach capacities. Mentalization-based approaches inform the work that an AMBIT-informed team will do with its clients, but also in the work that team members do with each other and the work with their teams, and with the way that the team actively works with other agencies and teams and professionals and family members in the wider networks that often gather around such young people. And finally, we use a mentalization-based approach to developing learning at work for teams that are often working in contexts that are high anxiety and stressful, which make learning from the experiences of applying evidence-based or evidence-oriented ways of working in these settings difficult to do, so that often teams repeat ways of working that actually may be not as effective as they might be. In general, on the outside of the AMBIT ring, there are 8 what we call markers of the AMBIT stance. And this is really a recognition of the fact that AMBIT is about what has been described as pre-therapy, about bringing young people and their families into a relationship where more orthodox therapeutic work could take place and take root. So working around the outside of the ring, we can look at the working with your client quadrant at the top, and you can see that there's a basic tension between 2 principles. We want to scaffold existing relationships because a team or a practitioner is not going to be there for the rest of the young people's lives, and we need to engage with the world that is really there already. And therefore there's a focus on trying to identify resiliences in a young person's network and to apply purposeful work to strengthen those relationships. On the other hand, the tension with the young people that we're focused on is that many of the relationships in their lives are not necessarily the most ideal relationships, and therefore managing risk is a kind of counterbalance to that wish to engage with the realities of the young person's world. And we often say in AMBIT trainings, there's nothing fluffy about the way that we want practitioners to take the management of risk seriously, with all that that entails. And we have some mentalization-based tools in AMBIT that help with that difficult balancing act, a kind of tug of war between those 2 principles that we try to balance. On the left-hand quadrant, in working with our team, we can see that all of the work that goes into making an engagement with a client requires an individual key worker relationship, a relationship of trust that can be built up with a young person whose natural predisposition may not be to be trusting towards the people who approach him or her. And it's in this trust that we are particularly interested in the idea of a particular kind of trust developing, what is called in the literature epistemic trust, a trust in which new learning can take place from another human being. And this is described in much greater detail in the manual. When we make strong individual relationships with the young people we're focused on, however, there are risks. There are risks that workers get drawn into relationships that may not be safe, or they may be drawn into a sense of misrepresenting the risks. Workers in these settings can become rather numb to the very real dangers that young people face, and a kind of macho approach to the risks that their clients face is a very real risk for teams in this field. And consequently, the tug of war on this quadrant between the individual relationship is to place as much emphasis on the relationships between team members. An analogy we often use is thinking about how one is roped together on a mountain with one's colleague, and one needs to know the way to communicate accurately to ensure that one's colleague is keeping hold of one's rope and is ready, particularly when one is in a risky situation, as one is not infrequently finds oneself in this kind of work. So the key worker remaining well connected to the team is the counterbalance in terms of our principles. On the right-hand quadrant, when we think about working with our networks, the tension is between the need to work in multiple domains in a young person's life. That means working from, if you like, the biological right through to the social and political, including the inner sort of psychological and motivational worlds of the young person, but also thinking about their family relationships, relationships with their peer groups, and the wider social ecology. If you want to work in multiple domains, including, say, education or the legal framework, almost by definition, you will involve more than one professional and very often more than one agency, all of whom come from different schools of thinking and will have different institutional and organizational goals that may not always be entirely integrated. And disintegration is, we would argue, the natural state of affairs of teams trying to do this very complicated work, so that the key worker taking responsibility for trying to integrate the complicated different tasks that are in play around a young person and their family is the kind of counterbalancing principle here, balancing a wish to be active in multiple domains in the young person's life. And then at the bottom quadrant, learning at work, the basic tension here is between a wish to use and display respect for the fact that there is some evidence for some particular ways of working being more effective than others, and it is only respectful to the young people and their families that we try where possible to use the most evidence-based ways of working. On the other hand, we stress the tension between that and the need for a respect for local practice and expertise, because the evidence that does exist in this field is often developed in field trials that are far distant from the populations that we're trying to apply these techniques and practices in. And equally, teams that are trained will already come with a great deal of experience and knowledge of their local setting and the cultural specificities of the young people that they work with. And we would not wish a training in AMBIT to in any way be seen as breaking things that are already rather well worked out in local teams. Equally, respect for local practice and expertise as a principle should define the way a team tries to relate to the wider network in its local area, trying quite consciously to avoid falling into the very common mythologies that all housing officers behave like this, all general practitioners behave like that, social workers are just this, and trying to avoid those kinds of unhelpful internecine kind of strife between different agencies and professional groups, but instead to be respectful of the fact that most people in this field come to work with an intention of being helpful. And the four main quadrants include, if you like, mentalization-based or mentalization-informed practices that we think help the practitioner in an AMBIT team to hold some balance in a field of work where, if you are properly engaged, you will be aware of the fact that you're actually constantly slightly off balance at all times. And the mentalization-based framework within AMBIT is really a way of using the team and some of the theory to help regain balance when it has been